Welcome, everyone, to our very first keynote speaker here in Generation Analog 2024 with the topic of home. Our first keynote speaker is Jay Dragon. Jay is editorial director of Possum Creek Games. Initially known for a horror game called Sleepaway, Jay simply took that success and ran it into a larger game called Wonder Home, and then a giant cargo container full of books called Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. And so we always look to Jay as an example of someone who's an ambitious and also a conscientious designer in the space. And what you haven't probably done is read through Jay's wonderful back catalog of playground and role-playing theory that is, a treasure trove of thinking on this particular hobby and medium of ours. And I should also say, Jay has an ambitious new Wizards project to the Wizards 7-part pact, which I am interested in hearing about as well. But at this point, of course, Wander Home is probably the first thing that comes to mind connecting the speaker to the topic of this year's conference. So at this point, I would like to hand the mic over to Jay Dragon. And then, as usual, the format is we will have the speaker for at least 40 minutes, and then questions and answers can be posed in the Zoom or on Discord, but better on Zoom for me to notice them. And take it away, Jay.
Thank you so much for having me, Evan. I'm super excited to be here. My theme is on home, of course, and yeah, let me talk about it. I got some thoughts. Because I traveled home for the weekend leading up to this keynote, or I traveled back upstate, I guess, back to visit my mom and to the woods where I started writing games. I wrote and ran live action roleplay, LARP, for almost a decade before I ever touched tabletop games. An order of operations a friend once described as like doing ketamine before ever getting drunk. Um, it was with the Wayfinder experience, a summer camp that was incredibly impactful upon my life and upon the lives of a lot of people in the RPG, actual play, LARP worlds. My friends and I, my generation didn't care that much for tabletop games. On my way to my mom's house, I drove past the tall trees I spent years playing pretend in until we got too cool to call it playing pretend. We had to figure out new words for what we did. Um, there was a lot of a focus on immersion, on presence, on the physicality, and the stories of that. I could spend this entire time telling you about those years' war stories. Is the phrase that LARPers use. A phrase I feel weird about, right? Both because war stories kind of evokes this status of veterans, of difficulty, of conflict, of pain, but also I think it is true in the sense that LARPers get together and they tell war stories, right? It's how we remind each other how much we love each other. It's you give these long stories that are about this is the thing we did together. This is the moments we shared together, or this is a thing that happened that you missed. This is a frustrating thing or an exciting thing. Um, it's how we remind each other how much we love each other. When one of us comes back upstate for the first time, you show up at the edge of the woods and you're kind of an outsider, right? That's like everyone's kind of they're a little on edge, they're a little unsure. They're looking at each other like, are you still the same person I loved? Do I know you? Do I know you the way I remember knowing you? And then the war stories come out and you remind each other how much you love each other and you're back in through the woods. New games theorist and game designer Bernie DeKoven talks frequently about the idea of communities of play, contrasted with game communities. A game community, right, is a group of people centered around a shared, like a love of football, a love of Match the Gathering. Right? There's an orthodoxy, there's a process there, and a community of play is centered less around a specific game and more around an ethos of play, right? A morality of play. As Bernie talks about it, as Duchovny talks about it, the idea of a scripture of play, right? A philosophy. They are constructed not solely through explanation of specific rules, but through the recitation of stories and memories. We're teaching each other what good games look like by showing each other the stories we tell about the games we've played, the moments we've had. So these war stories become a way to hold together our group, and also remind each other what makes us happy when we do get to play together. They're the, you tell a story about a thing that frustrated you to remind each other that it frustrated you, right? To like be like, don't do that. It's frustrating. We tell stories about things that made us happy to teach people like, hey, figure out how to do that in the future. Bring that energy forward. Um, it's impossible for me to untangle the friends I had back then with the games we used to play together or the camp we ran them at. Wayfinder created the trust we needed to play our high trust, high intensity games. The games broke down the social barriers and held the door open to our friendship. And our friendship kept us working at camp way longer than we probably should have been after we've gone our separate ways. It's not that there was a magic circle separating our games from our lives, but instead they reinforced each other. There was a kaleidoscope of interactions crisscrossing the woods at night. Things would get intense out there. More than once, someone would catch feelings for you, only to realize in the harsh light of day that it was just an invention of the game. These were war stories too. You fall in love, and then it's a mirage of the play, right? And it's not that it was fake in the magic circle and it was true outside of it. It's that there was a continuity of truth. It got different when I started writing tabletop RPGs. A lot of us didn't like RPGs, tabletop games. They felt like a pale facsimile of the real thing. Oh, so you mean I can't be the elf in the woods? I have to describe being the elf in the woods? How is Dungeons and Dragons even an RPG at all? Right? There was the abstraction was frustrating when you're used to high intensity games where physicality is really critical, right? How do you know what's around you? How do you care about the things around you if you're just endlessly describing them? I found my way in with games like 10 Candles and Ribbon Drive and Wisher Theurgist Fatalist, tabletop games that took advantage of the abstraction of the table to do things that you couldn't really do at a LARP. 10 Candles, right, with the 10 candles being lit around the table and the lights slowly dimming, creates a resonant sensation that you can't quite have at LARP because LARP is always a tactility present. But at a tabletop, you could create this kind of broader abstraction, and that back when I was a teenager, right? At this point, I feel like I'd be more nuanced thought about it, but like 18, 19, I was like, oh, that makes it click. That's what I've been missing. The fact that it wasn't just about how can I give you a sensation, but how can I give you the abstract sensation. Once through, the floodgates were open and a different sort of relationship emerged. When I would write and run a LARP, I was producing a bespoke experience curated for the specific woods and specific people and specific moment in the year where we played. We'd play once without any playtesting and never again. The appeal of writing tabletop games is I could teach other people to be present with each other the way I was once present with the people I love. As a tabletop designer, I get to make toolboxes for creating an experience. And even though I can't be there or play along, I can start laying out the groundwork for other people to go into the woods together to teach people how to build their own communities of play. Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast has been my big project for a long time, and it's finally out in the world. As Evan mentioned, the horrendous cargo container and the miserable stress of trying to be a small business owner while also making these art projects. But alongside my co-creator, M. Veselak, my business partner, Ruby Lavin Grubby, and 24 other writers, artists, and editors over the past 5 years of my life, we made our weird and wondrous dream project. The book is more about fostering a play community than anything else. When we sit down to play Yazebas, even though we're united by certain qualities of play, like the same characters in the same setting, we could end up engaging with any mechanics or getting up to any activity. Gertrude's surprise birthday party is as different from Hey Kid going firefly catching as Tag is from hide and seek. But the activities are united by the characters and the way we string those activities together and the principles we hold our play to, right? We could play Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast by, you can be Gertrude and I will be Hey Kid, and we're going to go out into the woods and play hide and seek together. Or we could play it around the table following the rules of the game. And this is all kind of encompassed into it because the important part is the ethos and the community and the morality of play rather than kind of the specific activities taken. And like a good community, it's not just the same close-knit group day in and day out. Sure, there's someone who takes care of the game itself, the concierge, and maybe there are some people who make it to most sessions, but anyone can come and play, and it's got room for everyone. Some of the most impactful people to shape my own copy are people who only visited for a single game and will probably never get to play again. Um, Steve Jackson. My very first game with my copy, I played with Steve Jackson, the American one who wrote GURPS, and we played. And it was a two-person game, and he was Parrish and I was Hey Kid, and it was a wonderful time. And at the end of it, he wrote a recipe for making green scrambled eggs on the back of Parrish's character sheet, and it's in big letters, right? Like took up most of the back page, and it's basically boils down to like take some scrambled eggs and put some green food coloring in. But it's so delightful to me that now every time I play with anyone, there is that recipe kind of bound there. Even though he was there for a moment, he's left this handprint on it. Um, if I play for years and years, their influences will ripple outwards. The community has war stories, has legends, has secrets. Everyone who's played with my copy of Yazebas is united, not by a shared fixation on the rules, but by a shared hand in a broader creative process of community building. I think Dr. Emily Friedman could probably tell you more about that as well. This is, of course, also what the game is about within its fiction. Yuzeba's Bed and Breakfast is, both within its pages and around its pages, an experimentation with what it means to exist in community together over the course of many years. There's a community of residents and guests, the community of players and concierges for a copy of the book, the community of fans and creators who express their love online, and there's the community in the woods that a lot of the team spent their teenage years running around in. M, Grubby, and myself all went to Wayfinder. We all met playing the same games. All these communities are reflected inside the pages of the game. Once again, there is no magic circle, just a series of kaleidoscopic arrays, lines and parallels and reflections drawn from one to the other. Community as a buzzword often prioritizes positivity and bubbly love, of safety and endless overwhelming care. For me, the measure of a community's quality is when happens when you see how people react to things going badly. Because there's no way to stop bad things from happening, but there's a lot we can do once something goes wrong. Each of these communities, right? Residents, players, fans, creators, uh, campers, are punctuated by arguments, conflicts, petty jealousies, and ideological clashes. Do you stay in community with people who don't agree with you? Each of these communities also contain bad actors. The comical rogues gallery from Eusebius of Rag and Bones, Nimbus Shadowside, and the Fairy Monday are funhouse reflections of missing stairs, bullies, and groomers. Do you stay in community with people who have hurt other people? And each of these communities are influenced by the precarity of the rest of the world. While Gertrude and her peers struggle with magic mirrors and skeletons in the basement, my teenage years were shaped by my community, my friend group struggles with homelessness, drug addiction, and sexual violence. It's easy to love your friends when times are good, but how can you keep loving each other even when the world's ending? Maybe you'll be able to find those answers with the people you play with. In some senses, the act of playing Yazebas, or even my other games, is an exploration and a meditation on these questions. I don't dare try to answer them myself. If I knew the answers, Yazebas would be about something different, right? Games are the creator of the game gets to pose you these questions, and playing it, you start to piece things together. But for me, these large games become about very large, almost impossible to answer questions. So let me instead tell you about one of my favorite moments in my new game, in Yazebas. There's a little track hidden away in a sea of other tracks, possible places for you to leave leftovers after playing a chapter for an hour. The track reads, once this track fills up, the bed and breakfast gets the roof retiled. This isn't exciting, but it's gotta happen. Set a reminder for 10 years from now and erase this track when it goes off, because we need to retile the roof again. There's nothing mechanical caused by retiling the roof, and no consequences if you don't do it. The world needs repairs once in a while, and it's nice to know the roof has been fixed up. But 10 years, like a real decade, I'm gonna be 37 in 10 years. Am I gonna be alive? Is that happen? That's 1,000 years away, right? I'm sure that a lot of folks in the audience who are even a bit older than me are laughing. It's not 1,000 years away. It's a decade. Of course, I'll someday turn 37. Of course, the years will pass. Someday I'll be in my late 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s or, hopefully further, still playing games with my friends, still sometimes thinking about the old and dusty copy of Yazeba's on my shelf when it'll be time to retile the roof again. The point of retiling the roof is not because Em and I thought it was some important game mechanic, like it was like, oh yeah, this is balance critical. It's a reminder of the long arc of time and the way we will still be traveling through it together even then. I've been back home running into old friends. Also, as an aside, everyone I've bumped into up here has either grown out their hair or grown a beard. I'm in like a TV show that has like a visual shorthand for time passing. Like I saw an ex-boyfriend of mine who like had a full beard, but like same actor, right? You know, don't worry, right? Don't worry, don't worry. Just the FX team went in and made sure he looked older. Um, some of these people were old campers, kids I used to write games for. One impish child was 15 when I saw them last. Now they've got like a retro 80s bleach blonde perm, and they write games for that same for Wayfinder. They're like one of the lead writers for it. We started telling war stories to one another, both remembering old games and remembering old and stressful camps. They tell me about what I've missed. I tell them that it reminds me of a time when I ran a game back when they must have been 8 years old, and they're 20 now. Dear God, I never thought time would pass, but it has a remarkable way of sneaking up on me. If I had tiled the roof the same day I met that kid, it would be time for me to retile it now. When you're traumatized, you develop a future blindness. When my friends and I were trying to survive during the tougher times during those teenage years, when the only things meaner to us than the world were ourselves, each season would sneak up on us. It's spring now, it's summer, surprise. Trauma doesn't let people grow and change. When you define yourself through the hurt you've been through, nothing ever happens. You just stay in your little circle, always surprised by the arrival of each season. When I started posting my games online, I focused on writing lyric games at first, although they weren't called that in their moment. I think it was lyric game was coined like October 2020, and these were all like, you know, sorry, October 2019, and these were all like 2018. I made artifacts of poetry and instruction with an interest towards always challenging what I thought it was possible for a game to be. One of these first games was called How to Build a Magic Forest, where you take a deck of playing cards and you draw on them and leave them lying around in the woods. It had instructions involving waiting around for years and years for you to be able to play it again, interrupted by periods of frenzied activity. It was a game about having a stable home that you could make your own with the people you love over quite a long period of time. In the moment that I wrote it, there was nothing more impossible to me than a game about the distant future, where even 40 years from now, you would still live in the same place. It was a fascination, right? That the idea of, oh, every day I could travel out into the woods and leave these reminders, or I could wait a year and then do it, and it would still be the same woods, it would still be that same place. It was fascinating by that relationship, even if the game was unplayable, kind of on purpose. And to create a home means to take something and really live within it. My friend Kazumi once said in critique of a fixation on safety mechanics in tabletop RPGs that safety, feeling like you won't get hurt in that community, is only the first step. After that, you have to feel like you belong there, that you can trust the other people there, and that you have the authority, the agency to make changes, to make things accessible for you, to make a better path for the people who come after you. When I talk about safety tools, it's always a first step, something I'm using to get at those deeper ideas of trust, belonging, and agency. It's a traumatized mindset to only focus on safety, to be so fixated on only ensuring you won't get hurt and never on ensuring that you can invest in the future. Right? Like if what it is to take care of yourself, take care of others, it can't just be always making sure you won't get hurt. Because the problem about being traumatized is you can't control what hurts you, right? I said we don't know, we can never stop getting hurt, right? Things will hurt you. Sometimes you'll grieve a change that's deeply necessary, right? When that former camper told me about what changed, I felt a hurt, I felt a loss, because there were things that were very important to me that were no longer there. That there were people who I loved, people who I loved who are gone, and people who maybe I didn't care about who stuck around. It's a hurt for no longer having things the way they once were. How quickly I forgot the changes I fought to implement, and the people who felt hurt over my peers and I demanding more accessibility, more queerness, and more compassion. The people who prioritize their own hurt feelings over the fundamental drive to make the community better, it doesn't work, right? It's the trap of being forever caught in that early moment. Never, you know, if a community is understood not by preventing harm, but by caring for harm afterwards, then only ever being stuck in that initial moment means it's impossible to grow. For a community to thrive, it cannot remain stagnant. It must change as it grows. I used to fantasize about having one of those D&D campaigns that would run for 20 years, one of those ancient projects which would leave the players at the end of it feeling closer than family, or more likely hating each other's guts. But those tight knit communities of 5 people who exclude everyone else, right, aren't what I'm looking for anymore. Me and my friends during those long winters, during those rough years, found that family, and we closed our door to outsiders. And there was a moment where it was good, but it also destroyed us, right? It was this codependent blob. It was not a community, it was a clique, and we ate each other alive. To me, a community is a living, breathing space where you can always welcome new people in, and you can always say goodbye without it feeling like a betrayal, right? Um, because that's the thing. Yzeba leaves the bed and breakfast in the end. I'm sorry if that's a spoiler, but the last chapter in the book is about her leaving and everyone figuring out how the hell to keep on playing, even if they even want to, right? It doesn't have to be an end of your game. After all, you never have to play the chapter. You don't have to ever unlock it. You can always just leave it there, getting dusty at the end of the book. But it's always on the table. It's always in the possibility space. And if the bed and breakfast is this perfect home, an ideal endless paradise, why did Yzeba leave? I moved to Philly a couple years ago. The Hudson Valley is my home. I'm more scared to introduce a potential partner to the mountains than I am to introduce them to my family. The woods make my heart sing in a way the city just can't. Those old friends still play in those woods, even if everyone's grown and some of the rules have changed and I don't know all the stories. I miss it, but I had to go. Something called to me, pulled me forward from the tiny empty fortress I had made up in the mountains, and I set foot to try and find a new home. And I can't tell you why Yzeba left in your particular version of the game. I think I know why she would leave mine, though, because she only unlocks the chapter where she leaves once she's repaired her heart. Sometimes a community can be a beautiful thing for a lot of people, and yet you won't be able to grow in it. Um, in these communities of play, right, in this conversation, Jacobin notes that the well-played game, right, his fascination with what does it mean to play well, the game must someday end. A game that never ends is an illusion and a memory. It loses what makes it good. If you try to hold too hard onto nostalgia, it just fades away. I think a lot of my work is fixated on nostalgia, right? There's a lot of, I think when people read Wanderhome, when people read Yazeba's, they find themselves kind of nostalgic for stories they used to engage with when they were kids, for worlds that they would imagine when they were children. In a lot of ways, these games work better for adults than children because children are not engaging on the nostalgia level. But nostalgia in a lot of ways is also a failure of reckoning, right? Because when we get caught in trying to recreate the past instead of simply honoring it never is the same thing that we left with, right? And when we try to hold on to it, God, I was with a friend of mine last night, and we were looking through old picture books, old albums of my friend had a Polaroid camera and would take photos of everything kind of from 2017, 2018 to the present day. And I watched through the pictures as I slowly fell out of them. As I got busier with work, as I got busier with tabletop, as I had less time and less inclination and less physical ability to play in the woods, slowly through the pictures, I faded away. And the pictures were still depicting the same war stories, right? They're depicting the same things that I missed, that I used to be able to kind of partake and tell all these stories with. And my friend still could tell those stories, right? Still had new, this is what happened to me at this week. This is what failed me. This is what was good. And I didn't know how to tell those stories anymore. And I wonder, right, if that's where Yzeba is left, right? If that's something we have to sit with as well, is that to create Yazeba's bed and breakfast, it can't just be a place that remains always and eternally this beautiful spot. It has to change so dramatically that at the end of it, its starting point cannot be recognized, right? You have to completely unmake it if it's going to be a true community, because people need to feel safe. They need to feel like they belong. They need to feel like they can trust the other people, and then they need the authority to change it. And so that stagnation will fail it. I'm I'm wrapping up. I'm less of a verbose talker than I think. I'm a very verbose talker, but you academics probably have more even to say than I do. And also, I prefer conversations and questions and discussions more than me lecturing into a camera for 30 minutes. But I want to leave on kind of one final note just to think about. There's a part of Wander Home at the end of it that mirrors the introduction at the beginning. And people, I think, don't often talk about it, don't often read it. It is very important to me. There's a little picture of a mourning dove above it, a symbol for sailors returning home at sea. And the passage is, "The road is a river that carries me home. I hold tight to it as it sings within me, louder than any storm, yet calmer than any lullaby. Press your hands against mine and you can feel this. My home, heavy in my heart and soft against my lips. Sometimes when I feel the harsh gales pushing against me, I can stare out at the thin and tangled road ahead and forget what waits beyond. But I trust the road. I trust the song. I trust that someday I'll cuddle up in my bedding beneath a canopy of trees, deep in the forest where the small and forgotten gods dance, and know that above all else, we are alive. Our care has a warmth all to its own." Thank you. I Hello, Evan. Are you there? Do I have a
I'm
flag?
here actually.
Yeah.
I wanted to leave a little moment of pause after that.
Oh, I
But
botched it. Oh no.
it's okay. Yeah, no, that we were talking about awkwardness earlier. That is where we're at. So I'm extremely excited to begin to discuss a lot of this. And again, I like the way that you footnoted a lot of major conversations, but without, I think, over you didn't go into so much depth that it's been exhausted. And so I think we have a lot to discuss. There
Yeah.
is, I guess, an opening question, which is how is Yazeba's response to Wander Home, right? Where you are on a journey talking about home, and Wander Home again has a lot of publicity, but then Yazeba's you saw really as this is our personal, like, proper endeavor with your team. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So how does Yazeba's respond then to sort of the notion of home, Wander Home?
So I wrote Wander Home. So it was April 2020, right? It was like early April. And at this point, Em and I had been working on Yazebas for about 6 months. And it was the early pandemic, and Em needed a break. She was like, "Hey, can we stop working on Yazebas for like a month? Can we like cool our heels a little?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And then May 1st, I'm like, "Hey, so I was thinking about a lot of the stuff in Yazebas that I didn't think belonged in Yazebas. I was thinking a lot about like I was thinking about stuff that like Yazebas brought up but didn't go anywhere with. Things like what is a game without really any mechanical rules? Or like does a game need mechanical rules? Or like what how can it like how can I think about home and searching? And I don't know. I just raised a lot of questions there, and it calcified into me just writing Wander Home over the course of like a month. Like the groundwork had been laid before that. Like the actual text kind of all came about in response to Yozebas, right? Like surrounded by working on Yozebas. And so for me, I think that there's the very obvious through line of like, yes, Wander Home is about looking for a home, and Yozebas is about being in a home. Um, but I also think that Wander Home is almost for me feels like the groundwork and the scaffolding to get to Yazebas. Like Yazebas makes more sense if you're familiar with Wander Home, right? Like it is laid, and also like to create Yazebas is possible because we did Wander Home, right? Like it set up the launch pad. So for me, in a creative sense, they feel um it feels less like, oh, Yazebas is kind of like it's post Wander Home, but rather that Wander Home by necessity had to be pre Yazebas.
I think you also raise an important point for all the game designers or aspiring game designers here that, when we're building games, we're actually building tools and yeah, tools to build other games. And that, again, PS also raised the point in the last panel, well, maybe this term game is not that useful when a lot of it is this kind of process, right?
Oh,
And
I'm a huge game defender. I'm a big defender of the phrase game.
yeah,
And that's
cool.
because I think that's because games keep us silly. Um, I think a lot about the from comic books to graphic novels, or from LARP to immersive theater, right? There's like a drive to take the thing we do that's the low art and make it unsilly, right? To like bring it into the serious world where we can bring it to high art, we can bring, we can get the big grant funding, we can do the big artistic installations with it. And I think that's a terrible shame, because I think that there's tremendous beauty um to keeping it silly, right? That's kind of why Yazeba's is kind of goofy, right? There's like I think that it allows you to engage with it more comfortably, because it's not in any meaningful way. Like it's not taking itself seriously at all, right? It is purely goofing around. And to me, game keeps us mindful and keeps us present with the fact that the thing we're doing is not sacred. It is where the sacred and the profane meet, right? It is the we are going to create a beautiful temple, and then we're going to be stupid little goblins inside the temple. And we are going to be very silly, and we're going to cry, and both of those things are going to be true and present with it. And if you just focus on the if you focus on the casual part, if you obsess over the goofy part of the game, you lose out on kind of the ability to make beautiful art. But if you focus on just the art component, you lose out on what makes it, like, I don't know, like you lose out on the joy and the heart of it, to me.
Yeah, and I think also with you calling out LARP as kind of your starting point, LARPers are very good at kind of, you know, uh, saying, I'm stressing out about this thing, but also I'm going to pause and say, this isn't real. We just made this up. And now
Yeah.
I will reframe it around that fictional malleability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, I have a question here from Jonathan Walton. He says, with a large swath of TTRPG play moving towards one shots and short arcs as the norm, are there new challenges and opportunities for cultivating the communities and mythologies that you've described, but with people who may not be playing with for very long?
Yeah, I think that is at its heart, right? The challenge of Yuzebas, right? It's we made it as a game where, what is a game we can play with basically anyone in 45 minutes to an hour. And that is a concern with one shots, right? That's a concern with, this is maybe a con experience, or a, summer camp group of kids kind of experience. But it also, to me, I think acknowledges that, like, for me, oftentimes the failure point with one shots is that I put a tremendous amount of effort into them over the course of 3 hours, and nothing lingers, nothing remains. And there's a great deal of heartache to that for me, of like, oh my God, I've made something. And if I didn't get a fully satisfying conclusion, then it's just gone into the ether. And Eusebus addresses that by having the stuff you do carry through. So to create the community of play, right, it says, like, yeah, come and play. It's an hour, but what you do contributes to the future. And I think that quality is really important for the sensation of community, right? That, like, you are not just doing something ephemeral, but you are contributing to a larger project down the line. And so I think that opens up that possibility space, right? Where it's not just oh, we're getting together for a couple hours and then we're leaving and we're never going to talk about what we did again, except as maybe a story. Instead, we are getting together and we are working on a tiny chunk of a much larger enterprise. And that is, I think, kind of where the possibility space starts to open in short-term play.
And I think the way that Yazeba's structures play is very akin to what I do with my 1 hour Discord games. Because I have two children, I'm always sort of negotiating. Well, no one has 4 hours, no one has 2 hours. Everyone has an hour here and there. And so one of the things that demarcated Yazeba's was a beautiful online play environment that allowed us to sort of log in and do it. I never got my group to that, unfortunately, while we still had it. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how you structured short online play, and then what happened and maybe what the future is for that.
I don't want to talk about the One More Multiverse stuff that much, because it's just, whatever. It's the we live in a society where venture capital has been kind of ballooning upwards many things, and with the sudden, kind of slow recession we are in, both sudden and slow. I think we're seeing a lot of those frameworks and guildworks drift away. I'm not really interested in delving deeper into that. I think for online play generally, right, Yazeba's was the biggest challenge was tactility. This is a game that we're thinking about as a physical object, but we're also making it in the midst of the pandemic when the idea of a physical object that you get to share together tactilely is completely different than it was, in 2018 or 2019. But to me, I think what's important is it's like to online play. To me, sometimes the way I think about it is that the computer is another player, right? So if I'm playing a 3-person game, I'm actually playing a 4-person game where it's 3 people and Discord, right? Like the act of being in front of your computers introduces another play element. And you can create games that kind of ignore that and kind of fail to engage with that. And you can make games that are able to capitalize on people's attention. I don't really play GM player kind of traditional game structured games online because I get very bored very fast and I get very distracted by the internet. And the internet kind of pulls me away from being able to do those traditionally GM'd games. And so to me, kind of the concierge, kind of the loose GM, full GM-less framework of Yazeba's allows it to kind of continue to stay engaged and present.
I think of actually the computer, sort of moving from military and government spaces to the personal home computer and the office computer to now just sort of being everywhere, and thinking about ways that we can see, the computer as sort of not only an autonomous agent but also as a domestic agent, as Lane Nooney described. So, where basically a lot of early games history happens at the kitchen table, happens when people are, not only coding, on their personal computer, but
Yeah.
also just sort of doodling and drawing and fantasizing and coming up with little sketches. And one of the cool things about Yezeba's is that it's got all of that in the book, right? So
Mm-hmm.
not only can you see it as a, a beautiful analog object, but it also has kind of computation in it,
Yeah.
keeping track of certain things, game state changes
Mm-hmm.
from one to another, and so it's almost doing some of that computer work well, which is, I think, why it's
Yeah.
interesting you brought it in as another agent, because when you're playing as Zabas, one of the agents is literally the book.
Yeah. The book is the house is the game, right? The book, the bed and breakfast is entirely the book. And within that is entirely it teaches the game and it contains the game. And so to to engage with, like again to refer to that kaleidoscope, the idea of like there's the community of characters who are engaging with the bed and breakfast, there's the community of GM beings engaging with the book object, and then there's the community of players engaging with the community of play and fandom and more broad outside of it, right? All these things, the book serves as kind of a, like, in my mind it's almost like a tether between dimensions, like if you go through these layers of reality, there's this one object that it's a tower between them. And sometimes we get very literal with that. There's a little joke in the book, one of my favorite little jokes, that's the protocols for safety at the bed and breakfast. It's like a torn up piece of paper, and the only legible part of it is, in case of fire, please exit the bed and breakfast and set the book under cold water. Which to me is very funny because it's the idea of like, oh, you're playing the game and there's a fire, and the fire is in the bed and breakfast, which means it's in the book, right? So you have to deal with the diegetic threat of fire, of literally removing yourself from the bed and breakfast, and then deal with the, like, I don't know, the game, the ludic threat of fire, that your book is now literally, your book is somehow literally on fire and you have to go resolve that as well. Which I think is a really funny joke. um but yeah, it's all continuous, right? And if there's secrets in the book that even make that even more explicit, right? There's a way that the house itself, the character of the house is embedded into the book, right? Which is one of another secret hidden there.
And I think also there's continuity with the social media posts of everyone just showing shelfies of the Yazeba's sort of looming presence, right? So
Yeah, Quinn's did a review of Mothership, and in the background you can see Yazeba's in a glass case, and it's like a ghost. like it's face pressed up against the window.
But in a very real way, you have entered the homes of, I don't actually know how many backers there were, but you've entered the homes of many thousands of people
And
as a
that to me,
significant object.
well, and that to me is the difference between like a LARP and a tabletop thing, is that the thing that I'm making, right? I had this argument with a friend of mine who, and my friend really considers himself to be a designer of experiences, right? That's how he talks about himself. He's like, I am a ritual designer. And I'm like, I'm not. I don't make rituals. I used to make rituals. I know what that process looks like. I'm an author. I create books, and those books provide the framework for rituals. But that distinction, that active interpretation, kind of the thing that I'm making is a book that lives in your house and is a beautiful object that you get to love and treasure. And then you interpret it in the same way that one might interpret a novel into a TV show, right? You interpret the book into a game. And the game you play is this kind of other transient art object that you are producing. But I have no direct involvement with that. And that distinction matters to me an awful lot.
Yeah, we have a question from Jacob Lofton. Jacob says, "Hi Jay, you spoke of your LARP experience at Wayfinder as a single untested moment, as single untested moments that were then played and gone, but the pull of the community was there as well. And then you speak about games that stretch over time. As you build these games, how do you think about how the stories are then carried with you into the real world and then sort of pull you back to them?"
Yeah. I think that like to me at the core of it, right, there's like a continuity of play where if you have a group together and that group has the energy, it doesn't really, that's always the thing that I think some people say when they recite the shibboleth of system doesn't matter, right? That a group of people, a community of play can kind of engage with anything and produce from it meaningful play experiences, right? And so, at Wayfinder, we would play these games that were these one shots effectively, right? There would be, 3 hours, 6 hours, 9 hours, and it wouldn't be revisited, it would be done. And I think to me, obviously, like there's a level of kind of an unsatisfying feeling you're kind of left with, and also a sense of kind of closure and finality. And so, of course, tabletop became fascinating to me as like a counterpart to that. Tabletop provided an opening and opportunity to tell longer paced stories over a broader period of time. Um, I think that I'm oftentimes thinking about the way these games kind of sit in your life, right? I think a lot about the game design of slot machines, how horrifying that is, right? The game design of a lot of video games. I think that's the closest I've ever come to thinking that game design is immoral, right? Is studying the game design of slot machines and being like, wow, there's something deeply evil about this whole process. And the way I kind of pulled myself from that morality spiral was the kind of acknowledgement of like, yeah, well, I just need to be super conscientious about how my games sit in someone's life, right? That if I'm making a game that I want them to play for a decade, I don't want to waste their time, but I also want to be really kind of caring of the fact that after a decade of play with a group of people, you've learned how to speak in a language that no one else knows, right? You have so thoroughly interpreted the text, you have mined it, you have completely transformed it. And I want the text to reward that and to play with you and to respond to your transformation. And so to me, like a LARP, running that LARP for 3 hours, my goal is just how can I teach people into it? How can I get people into it? How can I make sure they hit all the beats in that time period and nothing is left on the table? But when I'm writing a thing that's very long, I have to be like, how can I make a thing that, maybe doesn't matter for 10 years? How can I make a thing that is patient with you, that rewards your own patient? But yeah.
I've got a question now from Nick Orvis. Given this distinction you make between your work as ritual designer versus book author, I'm curious how you create the play/rituals that you yourself do that, if I remember other things you said about your process correctly, then feed into the process of writing the books that you write.
Yes. Right. So what I'm doing when I'm making a game, this is the kind of the point of playtesting is to like sit down with my friends and do it and be like do the ritual, right? That's me doing the ritual. And then I go and I take notes on what that was like and I kind of feed that back into the process, right? That kind of the beauty of playtesting is I get to like produce the toolkit and then try out the toolkit and respond to that and create a little cyclical loop of ritual and play and experimentation that the contributions and ideas of playtesters kind of wiggle their way back into the final project, and that itself is a process of ritual, and that is also a process of community building, right? When I sit down and play with people and I show them how I play, if they go and they play with their friends even years later when the game is done, they have informed that, they have fed into that, right? It's kind of a cyclical teaching process, a kind of a cyclical establishment of a community of play. And so rituals, running rituals and facilitating play experiences is still really important to my process. It's just second degree, right? It's I do it and then I learn from it and then I produce the things that help other people do it. And then I do it more, and I do it with things that aren't just my games, but I do it with other people's games, and I do it with weird things that maybe no one else is playing or that I just wanted to for no reason. Maybe I just do rituals with my friends, right? I was over at some former campers' houses on Monday, and we played a chapter of Uzebas because they have their copy and they wanted to play, and they're growing it. But then also they wanted to. One of the campers was like, well, now he's 22, right? Not a camper, but he was like, "Hey, I think it's the year of the Phoenix. I've decided that for the past 6 months things have sucked, and tonight is when." Tonight is finally when it is a new year, and we're going to do a ritual to honor that. And so we did a ritual to honor that, and we like welcomed ourselves into the year of the Phoenix. And this was just like, I was just like, yeah, this also is a game. This also is sacred, right? That is where games and play and ritual bleed together, is because it was only through the establishment of the community of play, right? Only through playing Yazebas that we, and through our broader play at Wayfinder, that we had the trust to then perform a serious, earnest ritual. I oftentimes sometimes think about rituals are the earnest form of play, or like play is the ironic form of ritual, that these things kind of interweave. And what makes them different to me at their core is kind of how tongue-in-cheek you're being about the whole process, but they're still interlocked.
I think also one difficulty I have with kind of modeling, good modeling of like what this ritual is supposed to look like is then I'm also saying here's what's good and here's what's bad. I'm creating my own little universe of what good and bad play look like, when it's what
Mm-hmm.
I'd really like for to see happen is emergent play, right? Just what do you
Mm-hmm.
do with it? I don't know. Here's
Yeah.
my interpretation, and I, I'm always very conscientious of the fact that I a player could take this ritual I've devised and do something
Mm-hmm.
very different with it, which I want to see happen. But by
Yeah.
me modeling it a certain way, I'm prescribing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a thing of like we do we do the ritual, right? Or we make the ritual, and we're like, okay, these are the things that are good and these are the things that are bad, right? Maybe good is uh helping Gertrude build up her self-confidence, like playing with that. Maybe bad is hey kid, killing Parrish, right? Maybe that's bad play. Maybe I don't like it when people do that, right? So I want to discourage that. I want to encourage that. I want to kind of provide the tools to be like, hey, this is what I think is good and bad. But I also first understand that people aren't always going to listen to that, right? And if there's a group of people who get really into Hey Kid murdering Parrish and playing out the aftermath of that, then if that's meaningful play for them, then ultimately I have no control there. Although I don't necessarily think it will be good for the broader picture of it, right? Like I think I have more system mastery than they do, so I'm going to bristle at it. But also, I need to leave open the possibility for them to do things that are not in any of the possibility space I was imagining is good or bad, right? Because safety, belonging, trust, agency. Don't know about that word, but authority maybe, or capacity, the change. At the final level of them feeling comfortable with the game is their ability to then change the game, right? If they're Once they've reached that level of comfort, once they got, not only am I safe here, not only do I belong here, not only do I trust here, I can now change the game. That is always going to produce play experiences that I don't expect or have access to.
Okay, so I think Nick's question was again specifically sort of then how does that feed you into your authorship? So we again have talked a lot about play testing and building the community of play, and what's a strength you have actually is there are already quite a few people who already know how to play your game by the time you're even writing down sort of the final version. But
Yes,
then
absolutely.
when you're writing down that final version, what is that? what does that process look like? Because it's probably a lonely one unless you're sort of group writing.
It is lonely. I'm desperate for positive reinforcement. I really struggle to write unless I've got someone telling me that I'm on the right track. So I frequently will I establish, I guess, a secondary community of people who I will send clips of my writing to, right? I'll send them little screen caps out of context and be like, how's this? Am I cooking? Is this any good? Am I onto something? How's this? Right? I kind of bombard them with little snippets and then they're like, hell yeah. Or they're like, I don't know about that one. Right. And like I kind of soak that in and inform that. I can't write lonely. It's the hardest part about writing kind of any. I try to write novels, and it was one of the things I really struggled with, is the loneliness. I really need to be in community in response to that, to have it click for me. And it does. I think it's the ritual of it's the feedback loop and it's the authorship, and I think that for me it's the feeling of how is this to read? How is this to interpret? And then how is ambiguity, right? If there's a moment when I realize the text is ambiguous, how do I sit with that ambiguity and do I like it? There's a little thing in Zabas where there's all these tracks that are calendars, and the initial intention was of them to be 12-part tracks. But when we got them back, they look like 14-part tracks, right? The Saturday and Sunday of the 2 weeks look like they're part of the track as well. And we went back and forth on it for a while. And then we were like, it's fine. Who cares? That doesn't matter. If people think they're 14-part tracks, that does not meaningfully impact their play experience. So, or even there's an RPG I wrote as an experiment where it's a tactical RPG, but the framing device is that two lesbian children are inventing it together on the shores of Ireland. And one of I'm talking through movement. There's a whole very kind of tactical, like this is how movement works, kind of D&D fourth edition style. And then at the end of it, it gets to diagonals, and the two characters who are writing it step back and they have the dialogue of like, oh well, how do diagonals work in this grid system? And the other one says, I don't know, we'll figure it out later. And then it moves on without teaching you how diagonals work. And the idea of that is it's a moment of early ambiguity, that's intentional ambiguity, that says like, I did not figure out how diagonals work in this text, and so I am putting it on, it's like a critical part of a tactical combat RPG, but I'm putting it on your shoulders to figure that out. Which is kind of, I think, provocative, but also I think ambiguity in games is good. It's part of the translation process.
Yeah, when people sort of fetishize clarity, they should also fetishize ambiguity. It's a more or less that you should not only say, okay, how can I make this clearer, but you also can ask yourself, how can I make this vaguer so that players have something to play around with that's still very thematic. We
Yeah.
have one final question. Find role-playing games are often framed as collaborative storytelling or similar. I'm curious for your thoughts on that definition, since you seem to focus more on communities of play.
I have oftentimes been critical of the idea of games as storytelling. I think that storytelling is one function that games perform, but it is not the only function. I think that storytelling is a rather limited framework for talking about it. For example, for me, I can have a worthwhile play experience if I sit down and I spend 3 hours idly dreaming about what we would do in the game or like what would happen and kind of like discussing it and laying it out. And I would not describe at the end of it the thing that it is as a story. And in fact, I think that frequently calling what we do in an RPG a story can sometimes do disservice to it, right? Because stories we hold to a social standard, right? We can say a story has red herrings or dead ends or meanders or loses the plot. These are all kind of judgments we can make of stories that I don't think are good to make of RPGs. Like, I don't think it is productive to, after playing an RPG, be like, that was fun, but there were all these red herrings that came up at the end. And it's like, okay, or it's like, oh, like I'm, being like, oh man, it meandered and it lost the plot. I'm like, okay, well, what was the energy level like, right? What was the enthusiasm? Did you gleefully follow where it lost the plot? Because it didn't lose the plot then. It just was a continuation of the experience of play. And so to me, stories are like a thing we can produce about the thing we did together. And story, like games, can also borrow from and utilize the framework of stories and tropes and beats and notions of storytelling we carry with us culturally in order to kind of produce particular mechanisms of play, right? We can play Fiasco, which is deeply concerned with kind of the mechanisms of a story in order to inform our play. And so our play is very story-like. But I think that it is, to me, not a collaborative storytelling activity. I think it is a play, right? I think it is, or it's playing, and would be down to call it, collaborative artistic creation, right, or collaborative imagination. But I think storytelling in particular is a valence that loses out on kind of an important part of a lot of these games. If I play Magic the Gathering with someone, my concern is not to tell a story, even if I'm playing as a, um if I'm playing a Yazeba's chapter where there are two characters kind of in competition with each other, my goal might not be to tell a story. My goal might be to win or to enjoy the tactical sensations or to experience being in the world. And I don't think that those are less valuable than telling a story, right? I think those kind of all get to be, those are not distinctly separable or meaningfully discrete. And I think you lose something when you lump it under storytelling as an aegis. But that's my hot opinion, and it always comes down to how do you define stories. And I find that frequently people's definitions of stories are either so specific that they exclude many RPGs, or so broad that they also encompass grocery shopping. And I think that if you could describe grocery shopping as collaborative storytelling, or if you don't want to call The Quiet Year an RPG, I think either way, you've misplaced your language.
Well, I also think the way we talk about mini games, like diminishing this mini thing or a sub
Yeah,
system rather than a system, I think
yeah,
was really powerful about Yazeba's is that it says, what if the mini game is the game? What if a
yeah,
sub system is a system?
yeah,
And we can accept these, smaller versions as the wholeness of what they are.
yeah. Because Yazeba's is not centered around its systems, right? You can have any system. You could plop in there and play Yazeba's off of it, right? You could. I use this as an example. I think I've used it a couple times casually of like, if I told you, oh, I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, but instead of any of its rules, we're using the rules for I don't know. We're using the rules for Ribbon Drive, right? But we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. I think you might reject maybe the notion that we were playing. It might be tricky to sit with the idea that we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas if I told you we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, but it's set in a sci-fi universe, I think that sits easier, right? The setting changing is easier for us to sit with than the mechanical changing. And with Yazebas, it's frequently the other way around, right? That it's easier for us to sit with, oh, I'm playing Yazebas, but this time we're using fiasco mechanics and we're playing a bizarre Cohen brothers Yazeba adventure, which would be fascinating, right? Or, that opposed to, oh, I'm playing Yazebas, but Hey Kid is a paladin and Parrish is a rogue and Gertrude is a, and I know they've got totally different characters, and we're not in a bed and breakfast, we're in a dungeon. It's like, well, hold on, okay, wait, stop. You've changed the setting, and in doing so, you have maybe taken out a big chunk of the game in a way that is harder to sit with than when you do the same thing to Dungeons and Dragons. And I think to me, the reason for that is because Yazeba's community of play is built around the setting, and it just makes it different from a game community, right?
Well, that's our time together for this hour, and I again want to thank Jay for being so generous with Jay's presence and contributions and really insights into a fascinating range of new games coming out. We look forward to Seven Part Pact when it hits the shelves. Thank you so
Don't
much,
me
everyone.
too. Thank you so much, Evan, for having me. Thank you.
And we return again. I believe we return in half an hour unless I'm wrong. And that